Is the Trustees Professor of Information Technology and Public Policy at the Heinz College at CMU, where he also directs a number of very important initiatives for the university, including being the director for the Privacy Economics Experiment Lab at CMU, and being a faculty chair for the Heinz College Master of Science in Information Security Policy and Management program. Alessandro's research broadly investigates economics and behavioral economics of privacy and personal data. And his research is widely credited with contributing to the revival of the entire body of work at the intersection of economics and privacy. For this research, Alessandro has received numerous awards, including the PET Award for Outstanding Research in Privacy Enhancing Technologies. So this is an award that's given to the best privacy paper of the year across all venues that overlap with privacy technologies, in addition to many other awards, such as the IEEE Cybersecurity Innovation Award. Alessandro's research has had significant policy impact as well. He's testified at the U.S. Senate, at the U.S. Congress as well. Alessandro, we're delighted to have you here today, and let's go warm welcome to Alessandro.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for being here this afternoon. I'm absolutely delighted to be back. I had the pleasure and honor of speaking at Princeton around 15 years ago. Wonderful to be back. And in a way, now that I think of it, I will be tracing a little bit of the history of my research from those days to today, leading to this question. Who benefits from the data economy, which I should warn you, I will not answer by the end of my talk. It's a big question. It's more of a framing device to tie together a number of different studies and the motivation behind them. I do not believe that a single talk or a single study or a small set of studies can address that question, but I do believe that this is one of the questions that we face nowadays as we consider the market for personal information, as we consider the power of analytics, as we consider human desire for privacy. So what I'm going to do, this being a distinguished lecture rather than a seminar, I will try to connect different studies together. And in fact, I will use what I like to call the hourglass structure of presentation, meaning I'll start very broad. And indeed, how broader can you get than who benefits from the data economy? And I will spend the first third, maybe a quarter or third, 1/3 of my time discussing the big picture. What I was mentioning, how my research led me to become interested in a research question, which really is at the overlaps of technology, policy, economics, society. Next, I will then narrow down and focus my attention on two specific studies, very recent. One, in fact, is yet unpublished. The other was published literally 3 months ago. And that will be the more traditionally seminar-oriented part of my talk. Of course, because I will be presenting two studies, I will not go into the same degree of depth that one would usually expect from a seminar focused on a single paper. However, please do not hesitate to ask me questions during my talk. In fact, I would love having interruptions, questions, interactions during the talk, as well as, of course, after and afterwards when we have the reception. And then I will end opening up again, going broader again, talking about how my current work attempts, if not to answer, still to address the question that I use in the title of my first slide. Okay, so that's the big picture. Now, what have I tried to do for the past 15 or 20 years, if I include also PhD, of my research on privacy? Everything I do is about privacy, but however, I am a social scientist by training. I was trained as an economist, but I was really interested in information technology, in computers. And so when the time came to do a PhD, I actually ended up going to an information school, Berkeley, rather than the traditional econ department, because I wanted to work on economics of information, and I wanted to work with a particular person, Hal Varian, very well-known microeconomist. His name will appear again later on in my slides. I started working for a number of different reasons on economics of personal data and economics of privacy. At the time, I was doing more modeling-oriented work, and if you know economics and you know modeling, you will not be surprised to hear that many of our assumptions in our game theoretical IEO microeconomic models were were such that we would start from the notion that consumers have stable preferences over privacy, how much they want to protect, how much they want to share, and make informed and rational, economically rational decisions around the protection of personal data in the marketplace. And through different market options, they decide indeed how much to share, how much to protect. Now, as I was finishing my PhD, and that was near 2002, 2003, something unusual started arising from anecdotal evidence, from journalistic reports, and from some seminal works by scholars. This unusual evidence I'm referring to later came to be known as the privacy paradox, the so-called ostensible dichotomy between privacy attitudes and privacy behaviors. Essentially, what people say regarding personal data, if you look at surveys, questionnaires, people care a lot about privacy, and what they actually do in the marketplace, allegedly, people don't care, allegedly, because they seem very happy to share very personal information on social media. Back at the time, 2002, 2003, Facebook didn't yet exist, but that doesn't mean that there were no other ways to disclose lots of personal information online. Orkut, Friendster, MySpace, and other systems already exist. From this apparent dichotomy between attitudes and behaviors, a research question arose for me, which influenced then significantly the rest of my career. Because from being a modeler, a theoretical economist, I started branching out into behavior economics. I started trying to read more about behavioral decision research and how it could be applied to understanding consumer decision making when it comes to privacy. How people make decisions about personal data, how much do they care, how much do they really value the privacy and the personal data. Which then led me, once I moved to CMU in 2003, to become naturally interested in online social media. Because online social media was and is a remarkable experiment in the wild of data sharing as well as data protection. Because individuals do try to achieve privacy even in public, even when participating in services and platforms which encourage personal disclosure. So I was teaching my very first class at CMU in 2004, spring of 2004. One of my students, Ralph Gross, was a PhD student, told me about the existence of a new platform, thefacebook.com. That was the exact title of what later would become known as Facebook. And we discussed it. I encouraged Ralph to do his final course project about thefacebook.com, which he did. And then in the summer of 2004, we decided to do actual research on thefacebook.com. So we started creating accounts on the Carnegie Mellon Facebook network, which at the time was just maybe 4,000, 5,000 users. And Facebook, by the way, was just literally 3 or 4 months old. We created these accounts. From the accounts, we were using possibly PHP, I guess, some scripts to automatically download what these accounts were publicly disclosing to everyone else on the network. And from that started a series of studies in which we try to, first of all, understand what people were revealing and what they were not revealing. What kind of sensitive inferences could be made from the information they were revealing. We were able to show we could predict social security numbers from Facebook profiles. Then we used facial recognition and re-identifying people on campus or online based on their primary Facebook photos. We did more social science research finding out that employers in the US were using Facebook to find personal information about the candidates, including personal information which is protected by the US legislator, such as sexual orientation or religious affiliation, which instead although it cannot be asked during an interview, many of us now provide online, and employers find it, and in our experiments react to it in a discriminatory manner. So these three streams of work, what I like to call economics of privacy, behavioral economics of privacy, and privacy in social media, are still the three streams of my research, have been and still are today. In doing this work, I eventually got to summarize what I thought. Once you combine economics, behavior, and technology, what are key open research questions that, in my view, are interesting from a research standpoint, but also critical, vital from a policy standpoint. And my colleague, Curtis Taylor, Leah Wagman, and I summarized them in a piece published in the Journal of Economic Literature in 2016. And here are some of the questions that I find most interesting and, in my view, yet unanswered in the field I work on. What are the individual and societal trade-offs associated with sharing and protecting personal data? Can we concurrently foster analytics and extraction of value from data while protecting privacy? How does privacy protection affect individual and societal welfare once we start deploying privacy-enhancing technologies, PETs? Do we have costs? And if so, those costs are borne by end users, are borne by organizations, or are borne by society as a whole? How is the value accrued from personal data allocated to different stakeholders? To the extent that data collection and data analytics create value, and I do believe they do, where does this value go? In economic terms, how is it allocated? And therefore, ultimately, who benefits from the data economy? Hence the title of my talk. And that to me is an open question. Because if you contrast it to what industry likes to say about this topic, well, it seems the industry does have an answer. Everyone benefits from the data economy. This is a quote from David Nelson. He's not an academic. He's or was at the time this interview was conducted a few years ago. He was an advertising executive. And to some extent, I believe these views are reflected also in contemporary research in my own field. And what is the view? Well, the view is that behavioral targeting is an economic win-win. It benefits everyone. It ensures that you, meaning the consumer, gets ads more relevant. And that's good for the consumer. Advertisers can allocate scarce marketing budget only to consumers more likely to be interested in the product. That's a win for the advertiser. Publishers win because they can sell. Publishers are online content providers, right? You know, NewYorkTimes.com, YouTube, someone on TikTok. They benefit because by selling online advertising space, which is targeted, they make more revenues, they make more money. And then not mentioned here, but implicit, who else is winning? Well, of course, the data economy intermediaries, right? The Google and the Facebook of the world. So this claim on theoretical grounds is legitimate. It's plausible. You can make an economic story around it, and you can ground it on in economic theory. So let me translate in economic lingo what the advertising executive was saying. And essentially, I'm going to claim that he was framing in a certain way the online data economy. And the framing is a framing where there is essentially a two-sided market. There is a market with two sides. On one side, there are consumers and publishers. On the other side, there are the merchants. And the platforms are in the middle. And they are indeed intermediaries, literal intermediaries, because they play matchmaking between the two sides of the market, meaning the merchants want to reach ultimately consumers, and they need the intermediaries to reach the right consumers. The consumers want to find products, and they need the help of the intermediaries to get these ads that increase the likelihood of a matching between consumer preferences and product features. So consumers have search costs to find the right products. Merchants have search costs to find right consumers. what the data economy intermediaries do is to reduce search cost. They use all this enormous amount of data to play matchmaking. And this matchmaking reduces costs and therefore creates, in economic terms, creates wealth. And this is reflected in the little arrows going out from the intermediaries box going to the outside. Wealth is being created. This is the story of the economic win-win. On theoretical grounds, it is a legitimate story, but the point is, it's not the only story that one can make on theoretical grounds. This is an alternative framing that I can also support with economic theory. Under frame 2, we have the same stakeholders, the same players, and we still have the same market structure, a two-sided platform market. However, now our attention focuses on a different angle. Consumers, us, we, have finite budget and finite attention. Finite attention means that we cannot pay attention, literally, to all the ads presented to us. We are constantly engaged in multiple vectors of information sharing, information collection. We may be browsing something on a device while watching something on Netflix, while the iPad is on TikTok. We may be presented ads on all these platforms. We don't pay attention to all of them, if any. We also have finite budget. We cannot buy all the things being advertised to us. This means that there is lots of competition between publishers for consumer attention. There is also lots of competition between the merchants for the limited budget of the consumers. So essentially, you have a two-sided market where there is lots of competition on the two sides. The merchants are aggressively competing with each other because precisely because of behavioral advertising, meaning that once upon a time, if you were a merchant producing golf-related items, golf balls or golf irons, and you wanted to target golf-interested consumers, you would try to buy ads maybe on a golf magazine. And there you would be competing with other merchants selling similar related products on the same type of outlets. Nowadays, the competition that merchants face when trying to target someone interested in golf is actually open-ended, because a person who is interested in playing golf is not mono-dimensional. He has other interests too. He's also interested in a vacation to Cancun, Prada shoes, renting a car for a vacation, and so on and so forth. These different trades mean that many different merchants maybe try to bid at the very same moment for the attention of this consumer, not just other golf producers. And publishers, same problem. Behavior advertising and behavior tracking helps them and punishes them. Helps them because, yes, publishers get nominally higher revenues from targeted ads, but punishes them because now publishers face even more competition than before. Before, if you were the New York Times, you were competing with, I don't know, Washington Post, LA Times, local newspapers, etc. Nowadays, if you want to grab consumer attention, you're the NewYorkTimes.com, you're competing literally at the same moment with someone on TikTok, a YouTuber, an influencer on Instagram, someone on Reddit, and so on and so forth. Competition is very, very aggressive. Instead, in the middle, we have, I think I can safely say, oligopolies. I do not dismiss the fact that the data ecosystem is vast, complex, and has a galaxy of players. That's true. But the point is that this galaxy is dominated by few very large players, the matchmakers. So using traditional economic theory, where would you expect much of the market power to be in a two-sided market where you have oligopoly in the middle and very aggressive competition on the two sides? You would expect market power to be in the middle, and that's where you would expect, therefore, the most of the surplus to go. So under this alternative framing of the market, the intermediaries are extracting surplus away from everyone else in the marketplace. So my point being that data industry wants us to focus on this depiction of the market, and it is legitimate on theoretical grounds, but there is an alternative story, and maybe both can be true at the same time. There can be an element of true of both. How do we know which one comes out more intensely? Well, we need empirical validation. And here is the problem. The next claim I'm going to make, which I hope it doesn't sound too aggressive, because I think it's a, I'm not trying to be unnecessarily provocative. My claim is that we don't have enough empirical research on who really benefits. If I go back to the claims made by the advertising executive and I focus on who of these stakeholders has been analyzed through empirical research, we see that the vast majority of attention is focused on advertisers. There is so much research in economics, in marketing, in IS on so-called advertising effectiveness. And the evidence that targeted ads command higher click-through rates and higher conversion rates is by now undeniable. It is true. Targeted ads are way more likely to translate to a conversion than random ads. But the empirical research cannot stop there, because there are the nuances in these results, right? What are the nuances? Some of the nuances, which some research has investigated, is that the consumers who tend to be converted through targeted ads are the consumers who were already likely to be consumers of the product, even in absence of ads. For instance, recurrent users. And in a way, the algorithms work well in finding already the consumers who would have been consumers anyway. Second, and to me more important, there is this potential issue that advertisers perhaps engage in what in game theory is referred to as a zero-sum game, a prisoner dilemma, where as competitor number one sees competitor number two using behavioral targeting, and see some of its consumer base shrinking because the competitor is poaching consumers, then competitor number one will also start using behavioral targeting. And it is conceivable that in equilibrium, the final equilibrium of the market is one where both competitors end up with the same market share they had before, just they are paying more for it through behavioral advertising. So the key research question from an empirical perspective here is the extent to which there is an increase in market share for advertisers. And that to me is still a understudied issue. What about publishers? Publishers, hotly debated topic, because some studies that we have done in CMU with Veronica Marotta suggest that the publishers do get an increase in revenues when they sell targeted advertising space. But the data we use suggested that this increase was limited, 4 to 8%. Once we came out publicly with, relative to random ads, okay? So there is a boost in revenues, statistically significant, but economically is not zero, but moderate. After we came out with the results, you may recall this, perhaps Google came out with his own study because they didn't like our results at all. And about 3-4 months later, they came out with their own study that they published in summarized format, maybe a 4 or 5 page memo, in which they got results which were larger, in fact, significantly larger than ours, up to 40% or slightly more increase in revenues. And then since then, other studies came out which are kind of in between numerically, ours and Google's. So in terms of magnitude, that remains an open question. But, and this is the important point, both my study with Veronica Marotta, Google study, and all the other studies that have used similar methodologies are utterly uninformative in terms of what really publishers gain or lose from behavioral advertising. Why? Because all these studies that we've done, including mine, suffer from the limitation. They are local studies. They look at whether this advertising impression brings higher revenue than that advertising impression when this is targeted and that is random. Fair enough, but that's a local analysis. None of the studies can look at the broader argument I was making earlier, the fact that behavior advertising simultaneously brings richness and takes away richness from publishers. Why? Brings richness through behavior, through tracking, increase in revenue at the impression level, but creates so much competition for publishers, which creates lower and lower revenues for publishers. And that's why, anecdotally, perhaps, many online publishers nowadays are struggling, and many of them no longer rely solely on advertising. They actually force you to subscribe, to register, etc. So that to me is another understudied topic. And what about you, meaning us, meaning the consumers? This is the least studied topic. And I'm going to go deeper into this because, again, it may sound like a provocative claim. I do not mean it that way at all. But I'm going to discuss how we know very little about the welfare implications of behavioral targeting on consumers. I'll go back to that. But I want to continue discussing what I like to call the mainstream econ view on data and privacy, and then raise questions with you on whether that mainstream view captures everything about the markets of personal data and market of privacy. And in so doing, I'm going to offer two other quotes. Now, rather than talking about the benefits of data collection in the context of behavioral targeting, now we are talking about instead the cost of regulation. How regulation of privacy can cause economic damage. First quote, Congress may rush into privacy legislation without due consideration of the options. There could be poorly thought legislative solutions, which could result in very rigid frameworks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this stance is somewhat critical, or at least potentially suspicious of the fact that privacy regulation could have on economic interaction. Second quote, in the perspective offered by economics and the common law, the recent legislative emphasis on favoring individual and denigrating corporate and organizational privacy stands revealed as still another example of perverse government regulation of social economic life. Now, you may be forgiven if you believe that these quotes are recent and they refer to the debate around GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, or the California privacy protection law. In fact, they date back 20 to almost 40 years ago. One is from my advisor, Alvarian, with whom we are still friends and still in contact, even though we may not always fully agree on all aspects of this debate. The other is from Posner, two intellectual giants. Vayan is well known as one of the fathers of the modern economics of information technology. Posner, among many other things, all the economic and law movement that he contributed to grow over the years, was also one of the very first economists to talk about the economics of privacy. But they wrote this, preventing the threat and the risk of privacy regulation, just before, at least in the US, an array of privacy regulations started popping up at all possible levels. This is just a super short list of a much, much longer ensemble of regulation, the federal level, the state level, executive, presidential executive decisions, court cases, Supreme Court cases, and so on and so forth, which did represent this rush to privacy regulation that both Posner and Varian feared, and which nevertheless seemingly did not succeed in stopping a $1 trillion data economy from forming, data markets from forming, a florid, rich commerce in personal data from forming. Essentially what I'm pointing here is the dichotomy between, perhaps the dichotomy between the fears that we economists sometimes have and industry has about the detrimental effect the regulation, privacy regulation may have on the markets, and then what actually happens. So I try to summarize this debate in using a admittedly imperfect metaphor of a balance, of a scale. I admit it, it's an imperfect metaphor, but I find it hopefully somewhat useful in framing the debate. Actually, in critiquing the framing of the debate, because I'm going to argue that the way I read my own field, okay, my own field, the economics of privacy, the way I read what we are doing and how it is absorbed in the public debate around privacy is the following. And I will be very curious, especially during the reception, to see whether you disagree with how I see the debate shaping up. I see the debate shaping up as essentially a contrast between two outcomes, either more data or more privacy. Essentially, the two outcomes are in contrast with each other. And if we have more data, then we have more economic benefits, more efficiency, more innovation. If we have more privacy, we have things like more autonomy, more dignity, more freedom, which is also important, but unlike the former, they are not really measurable, or at least not easy at all to measure. So we have on this balance, these measurable benefits and these unmeasurable costs when privacy is not protected. And I'm going to argue that we don't really know enough about those benefits. Going back to the quote from the advertising executive, we don't know especially how those benefits are allocated to the different stakeholders. To what extent the benefits are concentrated in the oligopolies in the middle, to what extent they are transmitted to other stakeholders in the system. Second, we don't know enough about the cost of privacy. Much of the mainstream empirical work on the economics of privacy, which is remarkable work. My colleagues have done amazing work. However, I believe that most of us, including me, have focused on the cost of privacy regulation. GDPR comes out, a bunch of us start doing all these definitive studies showing that, okay, GDPR increased, reduce advertising effectiveness, increase cost to these players and that player, decrease incentives for venture capitalists to invest in high-tech, information high-tech startups, and on and on and on and on. We do all this work on the cost of privacy regulation. We do much less work on the cost of the absence of regulation. How decreased autonomy, decreased dignity, decreased freedom affect people. Maybe it's good that we don't, because maybe there are things that economists should not even dare trying to measure. I can concede that. But the broader point is that our research focuses only on a narrow aspect of the broader privacy debate, and sometimes is used as the quantification of the debate, and that's risky to me. And finally, how much do we know about the very premise that more data and more privacy are in contrast? What if they're not? What if we can, to some extent, have the cake and eat it too? We can have analytics and we can have privacy. So in what I'm going to do in the second part of the talk, which is about to start right now, I will, that's a narrow part of the hourglass, so I'm getting now into the deeper part, or at least more focused part. I will present two studies. One study focuses on kind of like the left-hand side of this balance scale metaphor, and it is about what do we know about the benefits that consumers get from behavior advertising. So this is an online econ behavior experiment. And then the second study I will present, this one, by the way, is the one which is unpublished. Well, we presented it at the Federal Trade Commission PrivacyCon conference just last fall, but we have not yet submitted it to a journal. We plan to do so soon. The second study, we just published, came out about 3-4 months ago in Science, and it is a much more technical study. It's about the policy impact of deploying differential privacy in census data. Okay, so that's what I'll try to do for the next about 30 minutes or so. That's the middle part of my talk. Study number one, the one presented at PrivacyCon, it's with Eduardo Musri, who is a PhD student at Heinz College, and Idris Ajarid, who was my former PhD student, now is a very successful full professor at Virginia Tech. behavioral display advertising, consumer welfare, and empirical investigation. So going back to the quote I had here from the advertising executive, our study focuses on the consumers. What do consumers really gain from behavior advertising? And I'm going to claim that the value that consumers get from OBA, online behavior advertising, is more often claimed, posited, than actually empirically demonstrated. What do I mean by this? And also, how can I delimit properly my analysis? Essentially, in the literature, you can see two sort of claims, a direct value and a indirect value. This study focuses on the direct value. It doesn't focus on the indirect value, but let me nevertheless explain what it is so that we discuss it. I mentioned that we have more research on the topic, and then we leave it aside so that we can focus on the direct value. The indirect, essentially, is the value that we as consumers gain indirectly because our data is collected, and thanks to our data being collected, ads are more valuable for merchants and publishers. So merchants are willing to bid more for when they have tracking data for consumers. If they bid more, essentially higher bids, that means that they bring more revenues to the publishers. And more revenue to the publishers ultimately means more ability to provide high quality or, in fact, free content. Okay? So this is the indirect story. Data downstream correlates with free content or high quality content. Again, legitimate story on theoretical grounds. Is it supported empirically? We don't know. If you look at certain studies, you will say yes. Some of my colleagues have done a study on the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which was enacted a few years ago in the EU, and found that after the enactment of the GDPR, which to some extent interfere or reduce with the tracking of personal information of EU residents, the incentives for app developers to create new apps and put them on the market, on the app market, decreased, right? That's a sensible story. We did a study, we meaning myself, Christopher Chair, who is now at Cornell, and a few other collaborators. We did a study on Apple ATT, application tracking transparency, thank you. I always alto when I think about application transparency, tracking transparency framework, which Apple enacted in around April or May 2021, which in a way is, in economic terminology, an even cleaner exogenous shock, because the GDPR was predicted for a long time, and many players, many stakeholders had plenty of time to adapt to it, prepare for it. Plus, it was implemented in different ways over time, because court decisions came over time clarifying what companies can and cannot do based on the GDPR, whereas ATT is much closer to a clean exogenous shock. Apple announces the introduction of ATT. To be completely honest, Apple had already mentioned that they were thinking in those terms, but they never announced the date. And then 1 week before they do it, in 2021, they say, oh, next week we have a new iOS, and by the way, there will be this framework. We studied what was the impact of ATT on the app ecosystem, taking advantage, leveraging this neat feature that Apple ATT only influences iOS devices. And by the way, I should explain it. What does ATT do for those of you who don't have an Apple, an iPhone, or an iPad? Essentially, switch the framework for data collection on iOS, for instance, on your apps, from opt-out to opt-in. Essentially, before, by default, you were trackable, and an app could get your data and use it for advertising purposes. You could opt out for that, but few people do. After ATT, you cannot be tracked unless you explicitly opt into the program. And that change is a radical change in default settings, and according to data, has produced a radical change in the percentage of Apple iOS users who are actually tracked. But this doesn't happen instead for our Android devices. So this creates a very clean so-called diff in diff, difference in difference setup, where we can compare the changes in app development before and after the enactment of ATT on Android versus Apple, and we find no evidence whatsoever of a drop in the provision of apps on the iOS ecosystem. So my point is, when you look at empirics, the data about the relationship, the correlation, the causal relationship between tracking and provision of content is ambiguous. What about the direct value? That's what this paper focuses on, is the notion that when we get targeted ads as consumers, we benefit from those. Why do we benefit? Because the industry says that we get more relevant products and services, saves time, saves money. And indeed, we do know, that's undeniable, consumers click much more often on those ads than on random ads. So yes, I believe that the claim by the industry is true. I don't contest it at all. But, and this is my claim, similar to the criticism I moved towards studies of publishers' revenues, including my own study, I'm going to claim that also those studies that show increased click-through and conversion rates are limited. They actually capture what economists call reduction in search cost. The ads, when they're targeted, they reduce search costs. They decrease the time people spend searching for products. They also reduce search costs in the sense of they present products which are closer to the consumer preferences, right? So the gap between features of the product and consumer preferences reduces. And that's a component of utility. But, and this is critical, a consumer utility function is not just search cost. It's also many other things. The price they end up paying for the products, the quality of the product itself, the quality of the vendor, and many other features which are completely left unstudied by the claim that consumers receive more closer offers through targeted ads. Essentially, what I'm going to claim is that studies done in this area, which are great studies. I will not get in depth into all of them because, again, this is a lecture in which I try to connect many different works we are doing rather than going in depth in one. But I have slides if you want to see them about related work in the area. Most studies in this area, if not all studies in this area, are just not designed to answer the question I'm presenting to you, which is, yeah, search costs may go down for consumers thanks to behavioral advertising. But what about the other features which enter a consumer's utility function? What about the price that consumers end up paying? What about the quality of the goods they end up buying? And so on and so forth. We need a completely different experimental design to tackle those questions. The current studies take a campaign-specific perspective. They cannot address those questions. We need a counterfactual approach, one that looks at the different possible options that the consumer may have faced in the marketplace, and then compare these different options along different dimensions, such as price, quality, and so on and so forth. And this is exactly what we try to do. So in a nutshell, we ran two studies. They are nearly identical, with the difference that the second study was a replication study that we ran because the results of the first one were so surprising to us, and we wanted to make sure that we had not captured just some kind of idiosyncratic effect of time or some other uncontrolled variable. The focus was to compare along what we call objective metrics and subjective metrics, products that had been behaviorally targeted to participants in our experiment versus products that could be found through searchers and they could be considered competitors to those advertised in the ads versus random products. The objective metrics are things such as vendor quality and price, which are objective. The subjective metrics are things that our participants feel and told us in their answers, such as subjective perceived relevance of a product to them. Okay? And what do we find in a nutshell before I get into the details of the experimental design? We find that targeted ads, surprising to us, were associated with a significantly lower quality vendor and higher prices relative to competing products than one that the same participant could have found through searching. We also find the targeted ads are associated indeed with higher purchase intention, higher relevance, higher familiarity than random products. And so the targeting works. But interestingly, this effect vanishes, is entirely controlled by looking at participant prior searches. Essentially, the ads which are more relevant tend to be those for products the consumer had already searched for before. They are essentially retargeting. So how did we, please, Pratik?
Very quick clarification question. What is a good metric to objectively measure the quality of the vendor?
I'll get to that. We use, in a nutshell, we use Better Business Bureau data as well as Site Jabber. And the results were consistent along the two sources. So I'll go in depth, over all the variables. So this is in a nutshell the experimental design. This was an online experiment with participants that were recruited online. I will say in a few minutes where we recruited from. Participants were involved with us for 2 stages, separated by about a week. And there was an intermediate stage in between where they didn't do anything, we were doing something. In stage 1, we call it the URL collection. We recruit these participants, we send them to visit sites which are randomly matched to the participant out of a set which we had prepared before. The set, based on criteria used in prior research, was a set of websites that we knew to be likely to have on the front page behaviorally targeted ads. And then we asked our participants, after they watch a video and they did some training to learn how to use our experimental interface, we asked them to essentially right-click on one of the ads on the front page, and then copy the ad URL and pass it to us through the experimental interface so that we could get the ad URL. Am I making sense? So essentially, we capture the URLs of the ads targeted to these participants. This, I believe, brings up immediately some questions for you, as it did to us. First of all, how can we assure that these ads were really behaviorally targeted to our participants rather than random ads or contextually targeted ads? Short answer, we cannot be sure on an ad-by-ad basis. Nevertheless, we can be reasonably confident that the vast majority of the ads were indeed behaviorally targeted. Why? We use a combination of pre, during, and post-study checks to ensure that the ads were highly likely to be behaviorally targeted. First of all, before the study, as I mentioned, we selected websites which we knew to have behaviorally targeted ads. Why? Because we manually inspected them and we chose the sites. You know, when you go to a website and you look at the ad and you click on the little ad choice icon, I see Jonathan in the back smiling at the icon. The icon can tell you where the ad came from. So we selected websites with very high likelihood of having those type of ads. And then we only recruited Chrome users. So we sacrifice external validity in order to increase internal validity. Meaning, our results hold for Chrome users. I cannot claim that they hold for Chrome desktop users. I cannot claim that they would hold for mobile users or Firefox users. And that's okay because we wanted a clean, homogeneous sample of users of the browsers, which is, by default, the most trackable on the market compared to, say, Brave. In addition, we checked during the study whether our users, we use scripts and as well as a questionnaire, whether our participants were using things such as ad blockers, which would have made them ineligible for the study for obvious reasons, or add extensions that interfere with tracking, opt-out, privacy protective extensions, so we could control for that, okay? And finally, in the post-study, we did a manual analysis of ads versus page content to recognize ads which were likely to be contextually targeted, and we found very, 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 very few of them. So again, I cannot demonstrate, I cannot prove to you that all the ads were behaviorally targeted. We do believe that the vast majority were. For instance, that ad is for Benadryl, and the user, the participant, was instructed through our learning material and the demo, a little video, what to do, to right-click on the ad, and then go on, you see copy, link, address, and then submit that address to us. After they submit it to us, then the intermediate stage kicks in. That's where we use automated scripts and manual array work to grab, to visit the URL and grab information on the landing page. Grab object information. What is the product? What is the vendor? What is the price? And so on and so forth. Which brings up, I'm sure, in many of you, a second critical question, which is the same question we had when we were designing this experiment. Because if we failed in answering the following question, our design made no sense whatsoever. And the question is, how can we be sure that when we use our scripts and visit and click on the ad given to us by participants, we end up on a landing page which has identical content as the landing page that the participant would have seen had she clicked on the ad? There was a reasonable fear that we had before we started this experiment that the landing page may dynamically change based on IP address, some other factors, and therefore we may see different prices or even different products than what the participant to which the ad was initially shown would have seen. So does it happen? We are pretty sure it doesn't. We are pretty sure that we get exactly the same information the participant. Why can I claim that? Because we ran a pilot in which we ran hundreds of tests, in which we add multiple arrays to the following. One array played the role of the participant and grab an ad, such as the Benadryl ad, and then grab the link of the ad, pass it to other arrays which were distributed all over the place, and we're using virtual machines to simulate different browsers, different operating systems. They were using VPN to simulate being on different IP addresses and therefore different geographical locations. And then all the arrays were then comparing whether they would see the same information or not. So this is an example of one of the links that would be passed to us by a participant. The link, as you can see, starts with a double-click address, but then it's a very, very, very long string followed eventually by the actual landing page Benadryl. And what we discover is that if you use these long links, which are those which are embedded into the ad shown to the participant, you end up always, at least in our test, 100% of the times, you end up always with the same information. Everyone sees the same information. The same product, the same price. As long as you do it quickly enough. We tested the decay time. If we waited like, I don't remember exactly how long, but if we waited things like 3 days, then no longer that was the case. We would get either a 404 or we would be sent to the main page or other things. But if we were collecting information when it's fresh, right, we will get the same product, the same price as the participant. So we are reasonably sure that this method is robust. And then next to that, again, using scripted arrays, we search using Google for the same product. And I will explain in a moment what I mean by same product. And then we collected objective metrics from those sold by competitive vendors. We used the organic search results, the first page only, so the first, I think, more or less 10, if I remember correctly. And we collected price, product information for the search results. Now, what does same product mean? Well, in the case of things like Benadryl, it really means exactly the same product. So our scripts and arrays were instructed to find exactly the same product, the same flavor, the same size of the product. So about 50% of the total number of products that we had in our study were indeed such that were sold by multiple competing vendors, the very same product. The other 50% were what we call unique products that are sold only by one vendor. In that case, we couldn't really do an objective one-to-one comparison. What we would do, we would look for competing products. So imagine that Benadryl is only sold on one website on earth, benadryl.com, Then we search for the next best alternative to Benadryl, maybe a competitor or sell something different. And finally, 1 week later, we get back the subjects, the participants, and we present them in random order 9 products. 3 were the products that they would have seen had they clicked on the ads which they had seen on their browsers. The other 3 were what we call competitor products, the ones we found. The remaining 3 were, quote unquote, random products. What do I mean by random? Essentially, if Pratik was a participant and I was a participant in the study, I may have been shown one of the products shown to Pratik, which from my perspective is random, in the sense that it had been targeted, yes, but to another participants. And because our tracking and browsing histories are probably very different, they have a very low probability of being relevant to me. So essentially, this ultimately brings a within subject design. We compare these, and I get to your question, thank you. We compare the objective metrics that we get ourselves, and we compare the subjective metrics, which the participants tell us when we present these products, we ask them questions about the products. We compare them across these 3 types of products: the ad, the targeted products, the search, the competing products, the random. And essentially, we want to compare objective and subjective metrics along these 3 dimensions. This is, in a nutshell, the result, the design. Please.
You mentioned your tracking history for comparative critiques. So that just brings up the question, when you traverse the web, do you use an ad blocker or a privacy?
Myself?
Yes, app, or do you leave those turned off just out of professional curiosity about what's doing out there?
That's a great question. I do both. So I have one browser where I have a blocker, anti-tracking, all the kind of stuff. Another where I intentionally let it fly because I want to see what happens. You got it right. Because I'm curious, right? What happens outside. And that's why we were talking with Simon this afternoon about getting to click on these very annoying GDPR consent mechanisms, which are extremely annoying, right? And yes, there are third-party tools that allow you to bypass it, but in a way, I kind of put the cost on myself on not using them, because that way I'm forced to see what most users see. And that way I've been able anecdotally to see how the evolution of dark patterns in GDPR consent mechanisms has been in the last 2-3 years. Okay, so let's get into the results. I want to speed up a little. Objective metrics were, to address your question, Pratik, not just price, but vendor quality, and we get it from Better Business Bureau and SiteJabber. Subjective metrics came from the questionnaires. So they are self-report from participants, and we use all the, we use metrics using the literature, either marketing or econ or IS literature, perceived quality of the product, fairness of the price, familiarity with vendor, product, and brand, and importantly, purchase intention, which is built upon. There are 3 different similar purchase intention questions, which are then built together into one single matrix of purchase intention. Okay, study 1 and study 2. Study 1, I will present the descriptive results, and then I will jump into study 2 to show whether or not they were robust, and I'll add something which is basically a latent utility model, which tries to tie together the different variables into addressing the question of, okay, so what is the welfare effect or the utility effect of these ads? Study 1. We recruited from Prolific in 2021, 487 participants. You have the demographics here. They were only US-based, and as I mentioned, they were only Chrome users. Of relevance, the most important thing, well, here our population skews towards educated population. So once again, we don't claim external validity, right? We don't claim to be nationally representative. We are more interested in internal validity. Of interest is this, some portion of our participants were users of some type of privacy technology. We had them disable things like ad blocking and other extensions which reduce tracking in experiment. but nevertheless we still control econometrically for them to see whether the fact that they were previously using these tools could impact what happens to them during the experiment. What we find, the first surprising result was the following. And this is less about the participants and more about the vendors. Here I have a distribution of the frequency at which different vendors appear in ads and appear in search, organic search results, okay? So in the ads, this distribution focuses on the top 15 websites in terms of frequency. Among all the ads, let me go back here, 1,169 valid links, okay, meaning ads. That's the total number of ads that our participants saw. So out of these ads, if you look at the vendors for the products associated with the ads, they are dominated by Amazon. Amazon had 42 of those ads. Relatively speaking, it's the largest. And then there are other big players, Walmart or Target. And essentially, the large players dominate, but you also see websites that personally I never heard before, right? Such as mynamenecklace.com. Never heard it before. What happens with the search? We also have a very skewed distribution. In fact, even more so. Amazon completely dominates the search results. You can see how Amazon has these over 100, essentially close to slightly, about 10% of all the search results in our study were from Amazon. And you can also see that all the search results are dominated by large vendors, even more so than ads results. You see Walmart, you see Best Buy, you see Target, and on and on and on. And this already tells us an interesting story, I believe, which is the way the Google search algorithm works. It works well, in a way, in showing, in organic search results, websites which are popular and probably trusted and probably high quality. But that means that the smaller vendors have no chance whatsoever of reaching the eyeballs of consumers because their results on the first page are completely dominated by the big vendors. So what can the small vendors do to appear, to get attention of consumers? They have to buy ads. And that's why they appear here, they don't appear there. So there is a beginning of a story here, because these small vendors who have to buy ads in order to get the attention of consumers may be good vendors. They're just small, but they're good. Or perhaps they're small and bad vendors, because they are the kind of vendors who actually take advantage of their smallness to try to cheat consumers into bad products or poor policy, return policies, etc. So we have already, in a nutshell, the story of our results here. Please.
Another clarification question about the graph on the right. What was the data source for these organic queries? Did users in your experiments naturally search for certain?
No, it was, thank you for the question, it was the intermediate stage in which we, the arrays, as well as automated script, took the products advertised to the participant and then started searching for the same products on Google search engine. And then we collected the information about the organic results, who were the vendors in the organic results, and so forth. So let's get deeper into the results. Quality of vendors. How do we assess quality? As I mentioned, Better Business Bureau. I don't think I need to explain what Better Business Bureau is. And CiteJabber. Here I have Better Business Bureau. I'll show you in a second CiteJabber. What do we find? We find that, look at the distribution of vendors in ads versus in search, the distribution by BBB rating. The F vendors are bad vendors, are those that have lots of complaints because they don't send the product, or they send it and it's not the right product, it malfunctions, or they don't want to replace it or return you the funds, etc. you see much higher probability of encountering a F-rated vendor in ads than in search. By converse, you see more A+ vendors in search than in ads. You also find more vendors which do not have a BBB rating in ads than search. So there is this higher prominence of lower quality vendors, which is supported also by CITP data. CITP is a website which kind of provides some somewhat crowdsourced reviews of websites and ratings of websites. We find indeed inferior ratings for vendors in ads compared to vendors in search. That's the first result. The second result, prices. As a reminder, we had 1,169 ads, but I hinted earlier that only for a subset of them we could find identical competitor products. And therefore, only for a subset of them we could do meaningful price comparisons. What do I mean by this? If Benadryl is being sold by 5 different vendors, then I can do meaningful price comparisons because it is the very same product sold by multiple vendors. I can compare the price. It makes sense to compare the price, right? But if Benadryl is sold only by one vendor, and then there are other different competing products with other names, which are not Benadryl, then I cannot directly compare the prices, right? Because they are different products. So here the analysis focuses on the subset, which is about 50%, close to 50% of products which were sold by multiple vendors. What do we find? That 55% of the time, you will find a lower price from search than the price on the ads. 22%, the ad offer a price which was equal to those in the search. 22%, the ad offer a better price than any price offer in search. If we put these numbers together, we end up with some degree of price saving by buying through ads rather than through search. It's not huge, but it's statistically significant. 8%, please.
Do you know if the cases in which the ads had a lower price mapped to sites that users had visited before? Because it's pretty typical in retargeting to pick like a specific lower price targeted to a person.
Great question. Great question. We don't know. And it's not clear to me how we would be able to know. I think we may have. It's an interesting question. I probably would like to do another study. I would have to think about the design for the other study. Thank you for asking that. Okay, so let me, if it's okay with you, if I go a little fast here with the other results, because I want to say something about study 2. Is that okay? So essentially, because these to me were the most important results. Then we find other interesting things when we compare the subjective metrics, for instance, relevance, negative, basically the negative relative to the targeted conditions. Essentially, the random ads have statistically lower relevance than targeted ads. That's just a sanity check. So it means that, okay, sure, the targeted ads are more relevant. Good. So thank God. What's interesting is that once we ran study 2, which was a replication study, we decided to add a couple of questions. We specifically asked whether the participant has searched for the product advertised to them in the past or not. So study 2 told us that, again, non-prolific, different sample, that we did it roughly 1 year after study 1. We fully replicated study 1 result. We were very pleased. Everything that I showed you remains true. That's nice. When you do a replication study, you're relieved when the results are consistent. We also noticed that when we provide vendor quality to our participants, purchase intention goes down for the ads. Makes sense, right? Because once people realize, oh, this vendor is a FBBB rating vendor, they are less likely to want to buy. But the point is, these signals are not visible to consumers when they buy. They see the ad, they click on the ad, not that often they spend the time to go look for the Better Business Bureau rating or the CITP rating. So here is a challenge, right? That when consumers know, they are less likely to buy when they know the quality of the vendors in the ads. And then we use a latent utility model, which I will skip. because it would take me a little long to explain the technicality of it, but mostly, sorry, I thought I did here. Oh yeah, this. No, it was in the prior slide. What happens when we ask for people search behavior, whether they search for the product targeted to them before? Well, what happens is that the people who had searched for products were also the ones who found the targeted products more relevant to them. So essentially, the claim I made earlier that yes, the targeted ads are more relevant, but that seems to be driven by ex-ante search behavior. Essentially, what is happening is retargeting, which puts into question, connecting all the dots, the general story about what really is the welfare aggregate effect of behavior advertising for consumers. By no means I'm claiming that we have provided a complete or final answer to the question. I hope, however, that we at least have raised some points suggesting that, yes, search costs may go down, sure, but perhaps they go down only for things that the consumer already was searching for, so already knew. And by the way, quality may go down with ads and price perhaps may go up. So this is, I think, worth more analysis. So direct impact, at the very least, I would say, is nuance, in contrast to the industry claim of this economic win-win. And of course, there are several limitations. Some I mentioned earlier. You know, we only use Chrome users, only desktop, only Google search. We don't claim more external generalizability than what we have. Now, I went a little fast in the last few slides because I would really love to have time to discuss at least a little bit the second study, because this was the first, the behavior experiment. The second one was the one I was telling you, which is more technical. And this was done, again, with folks at CMU. Ryan Steed is a PhD student. He's the first author. Terence is also a CMU, also a grad student. And Steven, that some of you know. Those of you who work on differential privacy probably know of him. He's a professor in CS. I may have also an appointment in statistics. And he does lots of work on differential privacy. And our research question, and that's why we have this mixed team, right? Terence and Steven are the more technical people. Ryan and I are more from the social science field. We essentially wanted to understand the downstream implications of differential privacy. Differential privacy is a super hot topic, right? It's become so popular nowadays. I believe it's a super interesting tool, potentially very useful. Still in the early days of application, it's not a new framework. Cynthia Dwarf and co-authors proposed it already over 15 years ago. And there is so much great statistical, computer science, theoretical work on it. But in terms of practical applications, we are still at the beginning, right? A few large organizations started playing with differential privacy. One important large organization which has use of differential privacy is the census. As part of its mission of allowing researchers and other entities to use census data while protecting privacy and confidentiality of census respondents. And census is aware that using differential privacy can help this mission of sharing data while protecting confidentiality of privacy of individual users, but also creates some potential downstream problems, because we are essentially injecting noise to make it, to achieve certain provable guarantee of protection, such as that no longer we can re-identify a given individual in a data set, and we can know whether this person was or was not in the data set, but in so doing, we may affect and influence the results that other scholars, policymakers, industry obtain when they use census data. As a matter of fact, a debate started pretty soon when Census announced its plan to use differential privacy, and the debate became more and more contentious with politicians, advocacy groups, and even other scholars attacking differential privacy and specifically the usage of differential privacy by the census. Especially some demographers felt very concerned by the deployment of differential privacy. And some research started coming out, very good research started coming out about the potential disturbing effect that differential privacy may have once applied to census data. Now, this debate is useful, and the results are important. And there will be studies showing how, for instance, the deployment of differential privacy in certain data sets can particularly damage vulnerable communities. There is a statistical reason for that due to the size of the communities. But the point is, the negative effects of differential privacy are not just equally distributed necessarily. They can hit particular groups more so than others. And that's probably true. And in fact, we find similar results in our research. But we claim, and hence our study, is not the entire picture. Most of the debate focuses on the fact that before differential privacy, you may have a true data point, the ground truth, and then you add this noise, you inject this noise, now you have a confidence interval, and you can release the data, and some external observers may no longer be able to know exactly the precise information, the precise data point related to an individual. And this is what most of the critical research on differential privacy is focused on. That once you add this noise, downstream results may change, and there may be unintended effect, especially on marginalized communities. That is true, but we claim it's kind of like focusing on the tip of the iceberg and missing the much larger component of the iceberg. Essentially, the noise of differential privacy is noise which is added to other noise caused by many other data errors, which scholars are actually aware of, certainly census scholars are. Some of this data error is not just existing, but is even quantifiable, such as the sampling errors, measurement errors that census statisticians know, understand, and are able to estimate. Some of that error is less easily quantified, but we know it's there. And so our simple research question was, very simply, are we able to compare the downstream, perhaps detrimental effect of adding differentially private noise to the effect of noise due to data errors, at least the quantifiable part. I hope I'm making sense. We wanted to do this comparative analysis. So put results in context, right? Rather than saying, oh, differential privacy causes this community to, for instance, receive less funding, to rather ask, well, what is the impact of the differential privacy relative to the impact of other data errors? So what we did was to look at one specific application of census data, Title I education funding. Essentially, the Department of Education uses some estimates that are based on census data. These estimates come from CITP, if I remember correctly, I hope so, the acronym, which refers to estimates of children. Among other things, he produces estimates of children in poverty. And then, based on these estimates, the Department of Education allocates grants to different school districts across the United States to help children in poverty. Okay? So essentially, there is a census. The census gets the data, and then the census protects the identity of census respondents, publishes some estimates of number of children in poverty. The estimates are then used to calculate how much each district, educational district, should get in funding. This funding then goes to the students. So it's a very important issue. And we wanted to compare the misallocation relative to a theoretical ground truth, and I explain what I mean by that in a second, due to data errors versus due to differential privacy. So what did we do? Like I said, the census is used all the time for many different funding allocations. Specifically, we focus on the Title I. First step of our analysis was to replicate Title I allocation starting from census data. to make sure that we got the baseline right. So we use this CITP. The acronym I was mentioning earlier is Small Area Income and Poverty Estimates. And we use these estimates produced by census. And then we use the Department of Education rather complex formula for funding allocation to recreate what should have been the funding allocation based on CITP. And we were able to see that it matches exactly the funding allocation as published in official statistics, okay? So this was a kind of a reality check, step one, to make sure that we could reconstruct the process through which this funding is allocated. So now that we have a, let's call it a ground truth of sort, we start calculating what is the amount of noise added by data error, which, as I said, census knows exist. And although it may not know exactly how much it is in reality, it can estimate how much it is. And then we compare it to the noise due to data privacy, to differential privacy. So how do we estimate the noise for data error? Well, the census tells us how to do it. So there is a publication which explains how you start from MU-I, which is the published poverty estimate, children in poverty in school district I, and that's what the census is publishing. But the census also gives a factor, a coefficient C, and tells you that, this is our published estimates, but the real value is normally, we don't know the real value, but it's normally distributed around MU-I based on these coefficient CI. So based on this, we can basically produce 1,000 predictions of what we call estimated real ground truth, but estimated poverty estimate for each district, okay? And we do this 1,000 times. And then we do 1,000 times, we add differentially private noise using a standard Laplace mechanisms to these estimates. And we produce this xi tilde, which is the estimate, including data error, plus the effect of injecting differentially private noise, okay? And when we do this 1,000 times, then we are able ultimately to calculate what we call the misallocation. What is the misallocation? Y is the amount of money, of funding that a school district I would get. We compare how much money the school district actually had based on the published estimate by census, which is what the Department of Education uses. And we compare it to this differentially private version of the estimate of the number of children in poverty. And this differentially private estimate includes also the effect of data errors. And because we have the distribution of error from census, we are able to separate how much misallocation, essentially a school district losing money relative to the published estimates, losing money due to differential privacy, from how much instead is quote unquote losing money due to data error. I hope I'm making sense. And this is the results in a nutshell. This is the story of the paper in a nutshell. Title I grants in 2021 were about close to $12 billion. That's the total amount of the grants. Of those, close to $12 billion, about $1 billion would be lost in terms of misallocation, so school districts losing money because of quantifiable data error, okay? So the quantifiable data error can actually reduce what they would have deserved to get if some benevolent dictator had perfect knowledge of exactly the right number of children in poverty. How much more do we lose because of differential privacy? These amounts. When we use an epsilon of 0.1, which is a pretty strong privacy guarantee, considering that Census applications have used, I think, things like 2.5. I've even seen something like 12 or 17, I guess. Essentially, the larger the epsilon, the less privacy protection you have. The smaller the epsilon, the more privacy protection you have. But the smaller the epsilon, the more cost you create. At the level of 0.1, which is pretty good privacy, there is an added 50 million loss due to differential privacy. Essentially, school districts are losing 50 million because of differential privacy. With epsilon 1, which is not as strict, so less privacy guarantee, but it's still really good privacy, essentially it's negligible. It's this line here, which is negligible compared to the effects of data errors or the overall allocation of Title I grants. Now, truth to be told, these misallocations are not fairly distributed. There are winners and losers, meaning there are some school districts that gain, and they are the ones with the blue color. Essentially, due to the combination data errors and differential privacy, they end up earning. Sorry, this is only about the differential privacy. They end up getting more funds, and there are districts that lose, which are represented here with the red colors. And there is a correlation between the population size and the probability of winning or losing. Essentially, the district with fewer children in poverty, smaller population, essentially have less dollars to lose and more typically win. Why they have less dollars to lose? Because there is a provision in the way Title I funds are allocated, which is, if I remember correctly, it's called no harm provision. Essentially, you cannot go negative, and you cannot give less funding than, you cannot go negative. So if you already have low, you cannot go lower than a certain threshold. So the smaller school districts, which are especially concentrated in certain areas of the United States, don't lose, they may win, whereas large, highly populous districts may, in fact, lose. And it is a zero-sum game, because there is a maximum amount of money allocated to Title I funding that has to be distributed across the different districts. As a matter of fact, we can also calculate who wins and who loses, not just in geographical terms, but in terms of different ethnic groups. Here, you can see the 0 point, and the groups that have these bars on the positive side of the graph are the groups that are quote-unquote winning. They receive more funding due to the impact of differential privacy. The ones on the left, including, for instance, Black African American, are those who may be more likely to lose. We also can look at other features. We can run regressions and look for features such as population density or median income. And we find that the groups more likely to lose money are those with the school district where the median income tend to be lower than other parts of the United States, as well as the district which tend to be most dense. So yes, we are consistent with prior published literature that differential privacy is not maybe considered a little unfair in that different groups are hit by it differently. But, and I want to go back to the key point, because what I just mentioned is simply replicating prior research. I think our broader point is that that cost is really, really small compared to data errors effects on funding allocation, and most importantly, can be offset. In a manuscript, we discuss a number of solutions, either policy solutions or simply brute force monetary solutions. So adding more data on the table. Putting more data on the table can compensate the districts that are expected to lose. And the data we need to compensate is not that huge. So, in a nutshell, what is the final implications, the final message of this particular study? Yes, misallocations due to differential privacy do occur. Yes, they do affect different groups differentially, but they occur on the margin of much larger misallocations due to existing data errors. And we can understand where they occur, and we can try to limit them, to counter for them, which means, at least this is my personal conclusion, we can use differential privacy. And we can try to minimize its detrimental effect. So I personally, what I get from this type of research is that differential privacy can be a useful tool for policymakers. And it's not like those scholars who have criticized it are wrong, but there is a way to manage how differential privacy is used at the policy level. Of course, there are a number of limitations. Let me conclude, because I'm almost out. In fact, I'm almost literally 60 seconds out of time to go back to the story of this balance, right? This imperfect metaphor I've used. These were just two studies that I presented. Much of my current research tries to address these different elements of this metaphor. Again, it is imperfect in that I do admit that it's quite simplistic, but it goes back, I hope I partly convince you of this, it goes back to ultimately what is the most important question that we face. Who really benefits from the data economy, and to what extent, when we try to protect privacy, we are damaging in an impossible to recover manner the data economy, or in fact, we can protect privacy while still benefiting from the data economy, and we just need to spend more resources trying to understand how to do so. Thank you for your attention.
We have time for one or two quick questions.
Please.
Those losses you talked about due to differential privacy, was that an annual loss or
Annual loss.
So it's actually 10 years of loss because there's only a census every 10 years.
Or in the sense that then they keep reiterating. Yes, in that sense, you could say that they keep reiterating through the time the same data is used until the next census is run. Thank you. Please.
So you've mentioned, I mean, you've worked on merchant quality, so basically thanks to advertising, you can have like sustainable, lower quality merchants, I guess. Have you worked, or are you planning to work on the same on the publisher side? So does the ad economy support lower quality publishers as well in greater numbers or greater strength than otherwise?
Definitely yes. We were very lucky to get started a collaboration with a number of publishers, some high quality, but as part of the particular study that we are just starting now, we also want to get at the other side of the story, the low quality publishers. There is a term that some people in the online publishing / advertising industry have started using, which is the infinite inventory. I don't know how many of you have heard about this expression. It's an expression that some people use and some people have critiqued. It has some limitations, but it captures something which is interesting. The point that the challenge for publishers is that now a merchant who wants to target a person interested in playing golf no longer need to go to the golf magazine, no longer need to go on NewYorkTimes.com. They can get to find this customer when this customer is on TikTok, on YouTube, on Instagram, on everywhere else. In a way, this stretches out the inventory, and that's why the expression is used, the infinite inventory. It's not literally infinite, but the metaphor captures the point that there is this stretching out of the supply of ads. But you know what? Going back to the slide, there is something that cannot be stretched out. The supply of ads can be stretched out, but consumer attention to the ads cannot be stretched out. It's the finite resource, which brings back my point that behavioral advertising could nominally increase publishers' revenues if you look at the impression level. And that's what much data industry research focuses on. They show, oh, you see, returns on these ads are higher. But what about the problem that now there is this large supply which creates so much competition among publishers that pushes down publishers' revenue? So we are trying to do the kind of research. Please.
Yeah, from that portrait of the industry that you showed, it seems like the most difficult group to study in there are the data intermediaries at the middle, who, as
Thank you for the question. I do. If it's agreeable, I would prefer to discuss it during the reception rather than on video, because it's ongoing research that I would prefer not yet to disclose publicly. Not that there is much to hide, but at the same time, we prefer not to publicly reveal all the details of that particular study. But I'm happy to discuss about that informally. Thank you.
This would be a good time for all of us to go to the reception.
Thank you. Thank you.